What are we talking about today? Wayfarers of South Tigris, one of the latest from Garfield Games, and why this is an excellent disappointment for me. Why? Let's talk. Let me run you through it. Pros, cons, what you need to know. Is it right for you? Well, you'll soon find out. What we've got going on here is a twist on the classic worker placement style game with multi-use cards, a little bit of an engine tableau system with dice worker placement in this game. The cleverness is apparent from the get-go. You can see here I have a multi-piece board that is asymmetric depending on the side you're using, with a progression system called journaling, trying to make your way across the board to the end to trigger the end game scoring, which is highly variable, no set number of rounds, and we'll talk about that in a second. You have your influence over here in one of the 3 different guilds, and then you have the cards surrounding the board itself, which are going to be variable use in many different ways. From one, the workers that you will be placing on the boards, yellow, blue, and the invariable green that are going to come along. But they are not your workers. They are community workers, meaning if you gather the cards that they are placed on, they become your workers, in addition to the dice that you're going to be rolling on a refreshed basis, up to 5 of them at a time. That on top of the cards themselves, which are worker placement spots out on the board, but then the dice become your workers on the cards that become your tableau on your own individual board. Sound complicated? Well, we're not getting there yet. Each card has potential of triggering an instant effect. It has iconography for long-term tracking, including victory point scoring endgame conditions, as well as intermission-based journaling that you may need to advance just to get to the end game in the first place. Then you also have the worker placement spots around the board that facilitate those worker actions in the first place by then placing the workers on the cards themselves to do the action next to them on the board, but then creating a dynamic of influence and control, limiting your opponents in those areas potentially if it is just a worker, which is limited by the colors that are present, or your own individual influence, which can, again, go on these cards, causing other people to have to pay money to be able to interact with them, whether that is buy them, utilize them, or even take a worker off of them as an action. You have your additional scoring objectives here with the space cards, which again have the similar iconography of the set collection style variety, as well as many ways of scoring additional endgame victory points. Then additionally, over on the side here, we have the extra duplicate scoring cards, which play off of the space cards that I just mentioned, which you slot then underneath in order to potentially double the bonus that is given by the original scoring card if you meet additional scoring conditions. Sound enough? Well, we're not even talking about your own player board yet, because your own player board gives you a whole nother dynamic that you need to be aware of. This player board brings a new tableau aspect as well to the dice that you are bringing. As you roll your dice, you get the various numbers that are going to be corresponding to the columns on the board. They then allocate those resources or those things that you can utilize on your action themselves when you're either placing the worker, but more importantly, really the dice. And so this whole table is asymmetric between the player boards that you start with, as well as additional modifying tableaus that you can place on the board to give additional benefits, both at endgame scoring, as well as during the game to give said number of the dice additional oomph, if you will, allowing them to potentially be placed in more of these tableau situations that are going to have certain iconography in the lower left-hand corner, which you have to have the resource of to play in the first place, thus getting whatever is on the right side. You also have your instant effects on many of these cards, and then on the C cards themselves, you have sides that are matching, that depending if you match up the lightning bolt with the iconography of resources on the right, as you tableau build them together, you can gain additional resources that way. So that's everything all crammed into a small nutshell, except for the fact that we still have the guilds over here on the sideboard that you can place your influence in, not only to get endgame scoring if you have the majority, but then also to modify your dice, as well as to get additional of those resources I just showed you at the bottom worker placement style in the form of the river or the boat that you may utilize on many of the islands. Set collections are based on the 4 main tags that they call them on these sea and land cards in the first place. The more you have of a kind gets you an asymmetric, non-linear value of points, but then also for each set of 4 ones that you have in the first place, more points. So now you can start to see how this point salad meshes together. The workers being placed, the dice being placed, the workers being manipulated between players, the dice remaining true to yourself, and then when you rest or refresh your dice, when you run out of options or moves, if you've utilized your turns and actions accordingly and not had a whole lot of leftover gluttony of your dice at the end, you have the ability to get some of these additional workers that will give you additional rest bonuses in terms of currency or resources utilizing for your next round or round, as you will, thus refreshing and rolling your dice and rinsing and repeating. So how do I feel about this? Well, again, like I said, I went into this completely open. This is my first real foray into Garphill, and I am not a heavy Euro person as a whole. Having read through the rulebook, having played it now, having compared it to several other games in my collection of the dice worker placement variety, because that is my preferred worker placement style in the first place, I can see the cleverness that they have employed with the multi-use cards, the asymmetric boards, and the journaling of journeying across the board in order to achieve the endgame scoring in the first position. This tableau on the board itself, mitigating and allowing you to customize what values each of the dice are going to have, potentially for endgame scoring or for just when your dice don't go the way you want. Fantastic. The tableau down here at the bottom of your base player board gives you options when you might otherwise run out of options elsewhere, never leaving you quite static or stagnant. The journaling with your token as you go across from one area to the next is also going to be rather clever, and it's going to gate lock you, but also keep you potentially on your heels of, is it better to race or is it better to store and gather up more points before you rush towards the end? And it's, again, very clever, and I like those elements. The additional guild elements on the far side to be able to remove one of your influences to get a resource or to get some mitigation is really nice, because otherwise, you know, the first time you play it, that's a highly underutilized mechanism in the first place. And the slotting of the people or the endgame objectives for scoring underneath these tableaus as you're building them in that regard, so that you have a multi-use card here, and for example, is, again, clever. It's compact. It allows you to mitigate or manage however you choose to customize your individual worker placement spots, which is very, very nice. So why did I say at the beginning of this game that I just felt like it was a disappointment? Well, I look at all these individual elements and I go, this works. I see what they're doing here. This is clever here. You have all of the actions around the outside as well for placing your workers on these spots in order to utilize them. You pay the penalty of using other people's. There just seemed to be a little bit of a disconnect. This is trying to be, to me, a heavier Euro, right? But it's got definitely the element of chaos with tactical nature thrown in by the sheer fact that you're using dice in the first place, right? And therein lies the problem. You're combining dice, but you're also having these decks. And again, the whims of the decks are going to leave you potentially very frustrated, because you're going to end up with ones that have these little icons in the lower right-hand corner that are just not going to match up where you want them to match up, because some of them will only match up on the sea side of things. Some of them will only match up on the opposite side of things on the land. And you may not be able to necessarily get the ones you want, and there's not really a good way of clearing any of these to make room to get a fresher start. Someone's just going to have to take it. So especially at the lower player counts, and that's potentially very unsatisfying if it becomes a little bit stagnant in those areas. One of the other aspects as a worker placement style of things, right, is the acquiring of these cards. And for me, it just seemed a little bit convoluted in order to get the steps that were required to do it. You know, there's only one way to get the black cards up here. There are ways to get the land and the sea cards down here if you draw off the top and choose one from 3. But otherwise, to be able to get the yellow and blue normally of the ones that are out here, you're going to be having to grab these cards in the first place to be able to create the tableau. And it's sort of this cyclical nature, right? And it becomes sort of a how do you get more yellow and blue cards? Well, some of them, for example, will have an ability to get more of the black. Okay, there's another way to get the black off of a yellow. That makes sense. Well, here's a way to get a yellow, but that's off of another yellow. And therein lies the problem. It's not easy to get this card. This card is randomly in the middle of the deck, and there's none other out there. And if you can't get that easily, what you find yourself doing is just drawing 3, grabbing 1, drawing 3, grabbing 1, and then ending up with a tableau that really doesn't utilize what you want it to do in the first place. And as for a game that is trying to be heavier on the Euro side of things, that's a lot of a randomization and a lot of frustration from a draw pile. Now times that times 3 or 4 even. And therein lies my dilemma of just the disconnect of putting those elements together to be able to actually get the resources I want in the first place. And some of that obviously is the strategy that goes along with mitigating what is given to you in the first place. And I'm not saying that there isn't that element. I mean, that is the most massive element, but just the dichotomy between, when I think of Euro games as a non-Euro person, I think of very strategically heavy. And this one is sort of straddling the fence a little bit too much for me, a little bit too little of the pure strategy because of the randomness between the dice and the card draws and just these mildly, I'll say, stagnant areas around the outside, but then also not enough chaos to just totally, here we go and go for it because it's going to be crazy, and you mitigate and you just, have randomness all over the board too, because it's definitely not trying to go that route, even though your tableau of your personal player board is going to, allow some of that at the same time. So, and maybe this last point is going to be a little bit underplayed, but a lot of the land cards, for example, have camels and telescopes. And your player board really only has the telescope under the 6 column. And there are only literally 2 cards under here that are going to give you additional telescope. One other thing I have to point out here at the very end of things that I had a little bit of disconnect with in my first couple games is that of the 36 card decks, right, you have the player characters that are going to be slotted underneath that give you bonuses when you place your worker there. Basically a way to actually be able to take some of those worker placement actions of the dice in the first place, allowing you to have the resources that maybe the dice don't. And again, clever mechanism, like it. But you have 2 cards in this 36 deck, people deck, if you will, that have telescopes on them. So unless you roll a 6, you're not going to be getting a whole lot, and you're not going to be having this. But then herein lies the dilemma. You have a disproportionately number of telescope requiring worker placement spots in the land deck of 8 of the 36 of them. And so the ability to get a camel, because almost all of them require camels, 1 or 2 require the birds or the pigeons, but to get the camel as well as the telescope there becomes very, very difficult. And especially if those are the ones that are out in the tableau, or those are the ones that you start with, or if those are the ones, especially if you're teaching the game to new people, that they end up with, it makes your choices at the beginning of the game very, very slow, and you can fall behind very, very quickly. And that disproportionate combination there was a little bit off-putting at times when we started playing it. Again, maybe not a huge issue once you've played the game 3 or 4 times and you know to avoid those until you can get the right combination of things, or until you maybe go heavier on the sea if those are up, and those sorts of things. But if you don't know that going in, that's a, huge learning curve issue that kind of left me high and dry in the first game or 2. So again, minor thing. If you don't mind going through a few more hoops to get these cards in your front of your tableau, if you don't mind mitigating some of the disasters that are brought to you in the first place, rather than being able to plan out your perfect strategy, I mean, yes, this game is fantastic. It's not nearly as heavy as the rule book or other people want to make it out. I had a harder time learning Earth, practically, as well as, Arc Nova recently, than I did with this. This works out very intuitively. Now, the evolution of this one is a little bit deeper, I think, than those other 2. In terms of the more you get in to play it, more strategy is definitely going to be involved. I would make that argument, but the learn to play of the actual mechanics is, not as bad as I was initially expecting as a whole. When I look at this game as a whole, I get the feeling that at some point, the Venn diagram of it's not going to be quite heavy enough and strategic enough for the heavy Euro lovers, but it's not going to be chaotic random enough or potentially it's still going to be too much. A is required to get to B, required to get to C, required to get to D for the Amerithrash dabbling their toes into this style of game people like myself, if that makes sense. Straddling that fence where I don't feel like it's really getting the full benefit of either side of the fence. So all in all, what do I think? I mean, yes, I see why people like this game. I love the variability. I love the asymmetry of this board of both sides. I think that's fantastic. I love the guilds. I love the multi-action cards. I love the slotting, but the sum of the parts is not greater than the individual parts for me. It just does not connect as well as I would like, even though I would love to see this journaling progression as a measure of the game progress in other games. I think this is an absolutely fantastic mechanism, but it just seems, again, getting the cards, making the tableau, the combination with this, as well as sometimes just the space bonus points, it just seems a little bit either convoluted or just a little bit too all over the place for me to feel like this is going to be a great game for me or my gaming group at this point. And so for that reason, I mean, I'm going to end up trading it away. I traded for it, but I'm going to end up trading it away now. And that's sad to say because I really wanted to like this one. So now I'm kind of looking at Scholars of the South Tigris as well. Maybe I'm the only one, you know? Again, not that it's a bad game, but it kind of just did not hit home for me personally at this time. So there you go. Those are my thoughts. Wayfarers of the South Tigris. Let me know what you think. Stay classy. See you around.